So with the clutch cover off, we can now see underneath a number of components. Firstly, we have the clutch, which is this unit here. We have the centrifugal oil filter here, which is on the end of the crankshaft. And then we have, down here, we have the oil pump. Now, underneath the clutch cover itself, we can see the actuator arm. We have the little sight glass down here, which is used for checking that we have oil in our engine. So there's the sight glass on the other side. And then we also have our dipstick for checking the level of oil in the motorcycle engine. So ordinarily this will be filled with oil up to a certain level, and our dipstick here will measure or indicate where that oil level should be. So it should, judging by the dipstick, it should be around this level here. Now the actuator arm plays a role for acting on the push rod, which is in the center of the clutch. So I'll come back to the clutch in a minute, but let's go ahead and disassemble. First of all, I'm going to disassemble the centrifugal oil filter. Now, a centrifugal oil filter will not be found on every motorcycle. It's generally only found on smaller motorcycles, smaller cc engines, like this one. On larger engines, they will probably have an externally mounted oil filter. So I've got my tools here. I can just go ahead and take this centrifugal oil filter off. But essentially the way it works is that oil is pumped up by the oil pump. So the oil pump pumps up oil and it comes out through this little orifice here, this little breaker well, I suppose. It feeds into this well, and from that well it feeds along here in the clutch cover, and it comes out through this little hole just here. So it comes out through that little hole just there. So hopefully you can see that quite easily. So again, oil fills up into that well, goes down through in the middle of the clutch cover and comes out through this little hole. And this little hole gels up with this hole on the centrifugal oil filter. So the oil goes into the centrifugal oil filter. When the engine is running, the centrifugal oil filter is turning on the end of the crankshaft. What happens is the oil comes in through this little nozzle here, and due to centrifugal force it gets flung against the walls or the outside of the centrifugal oil filter, and it collects and deposits there. Okay, so I've done a video where I explain it in complete detail how the centrifugal oil filter works. You can take a look at that if you want to see it in better detail, but I'll just go ahead and just take it off here. So I just remove these 3 screws. Ordinarily these screws will be torqued down quite tightly. So I remove the cover. And once I remove the cover, I can now access some dirt. There's a little nut, a special nut, which needs a special socket, a peg socket, to remove the nut. It's an internal nut. Okay, so this is a special tool that you will have to buy to remove the centrifugal oil filter. So I've already loosened it, so I probably don't need the ratchet there. So I just need to fit it in. So it connects in with these little protrusions on the end of the socket. So I just can get it to mesh in. There we go. And just turn it. And off comes my little nut. So there's that special, it's an internal nut. And when that nut comes off, I can just pull the centrifugal oil filter off the end of the crankshaft. Now there's also a little washer. And it says outside, so I just have to be careful not to lose that. Put it all back together so nothing gets lost. And I'll put them to one side. So that's the centrifugal oil filter. Now, our oil pump. Now the oil pump, again I've done a separate video on how the oil pump works, but the oil pump is driven by this little plastic gear, so this little driven gear. And this driven gear is driven by this little gear that's on the end of the crankshaft. So I can actually slide off this little gear from the end of the crankshaft quite easily. But as you can see, when the engine is running, it's actually driving this oil, it's driving the gear, the driven gear of the oil pump. Okay, so that's, now, as I said, I have done a separate video on how the oil pump works. So I'm just going to remove it, and you can take a look at the separate video. If you want more detail on how the oil pump works. But essentially all it does is it receives in oil in through one orifice, which I'll show you now in a second. So it's held on with 2 bolts. I've already removed one of the bolts. Or screws, I suppose. Just take it off. Take off the screw, and there's our oil pump. So the pump is driven by this gear, and this is the pump itself. So oil comes in through one of the orifices. There's 2 holes here. So the oil comes in through one of the orifices and is pumped out through the other orifice. Now I can open this up just to show you quickly. Don't want to ruin these screws. Now this type of pump, oil pump, is called a trochoid oil pump. So that little, should just be able to take the lid off. Okay, take the cover off, and that's our little trochoid oil pump. So it's actually a very simple device. So as you can see, there's just 2 rotors. There's an internal rotor and an external rotor. And as the, well, I'll just do it here, as the driven gear rotates, it drives the internal rotor inside the outside rotor, and that draws oil in and pumps it out through the 2 orifices. So that's the oil pump. It's a simple device. So I'll leave that to one side as well. Now I can take off this primary drive gear and just slide it off like that, which is on the end of the crankshaft. I'll just leave it on for a second because I want to talk about the clutch. But just to draw your attention, you can see where the oil is fed in to the oil pump through this little outlet here from the engine, and then it's fed back into the engine, up through the orifices of the engine, through this outlet here. And there's 2 little black oil seals on the, just on the other side where the oil pump sits. Now let's talk about the clutch briefly. Now the clutch, For this particular clutch, I have done, again, a separate video on that, so I can just spend a lot more time talking about how it works in precise detail. But for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to talk about it as briefly as I can. So the role of the clutch, is to disengage the crankshaft from the input shaft of the engine. So the engine has 3 shafts, and you're going to see them probably in a little bit more detail in a minute once I remove this. But there is the crankshaft, which is connected to the piston. So the crankshaft, when the engine is running, the piston is going up and down, and it is driving the crankshaft all the time. Now the crankshaft, through this primary drive gear, acts on this driven gear here, which is connected to the clutch, to the back of the clutch. So you can just see it there the whole way around. So the crankshaft drives this gear to rotate constantly. And with it, it brings the clutch basket. So the clutch basket is this metal basket, I suppose, that you see that the clutch actually sits in. And you can see here that the clutch is meshed in with some plates, which are here. Okay? So it's meshed in with these plates. So these plates, these are called the friction plates, and they rotate with the clutch basket when it's rotating. And when the engine is running, this gear, clutch basket, and the friction plates are constantly turning with the crankshaft. So when the engine's running, they're always turning. Now, what you can see, until I just tip it over just a little bit, is that there is spaces between each of the. There is spaces between each of the friction plates, and what actually is between each of the friction plates is the plane plates. Okay, so they're just metal plates. They don't have a coating of friction material on them. And the plane plates have little, instead of having teeth that are facing outwards like the friction plates, the plane plates have teeth which are meshed with the clutch center. Okay, now the clutch center, which is just this metal unit here, is meshed with the input shaft. So when the input shaft rotates, the clutch center rotates with it. And the plane plates are meshed with the clutch center, and as a result they are meshed with the input shaft. Now the only thing that's actually connecting the friction plates and the plane plates is because they are squished together. So think of my 2 hands here. They're basically the plates. The only contact that the plates have is basically a friction like this. Okay. Now, when my hands are loosely pressed together, there is very little friction stopping them, so they can move independently. Now, when I squeeze my hands together and try to move one hand up or down, it becomes a lot harder. And in fact, if I squeeze hard enough, I can't move my 2 hands independently. They become act as one unit. Okay, and if I release that pressure, they again are able to rotate separately. And that's essentially what's going on between the friction plates and the plane plates. And that pressure is supplied to the clutch pack of plates through the clutch springs, and through the pressure plate, which is connected to the clutch springs. Now the springs, which are held in with the spring bolts, and you can see that there's this plate here, it's called a lifting plate, and it is acted on through this. So the lifting plate is acted on through this little push rod. So again, when I pull my clutch lever, pressurizes, it pulls moves the actuating arm. The actuating arm acts on the push rod, and that push rod pushes that lifting plate inwards. And when it's pushed inwards, it releases the pressure on the clutch pack, and the friction plates are able to rotate independently of the plane plates. So once that pressure between the plates is lifted through that lifting plate, the pressure is released on the clutch pack, and the friction plates are able to rotate independently of the plane plates. So the plane plates will be connected to the clutch center, and this unit will stop rotating while the rest, so at the moment you can see that the clutch center, the lifting plate is all rotating with the clutch housing or the clutch basket and the friction plates. But once that pressure is released, they will stop moving, and you will see that the clutch housing or clutch basket will rotate with the friction plates, but the clutch center will not rotate. And again, the clutch center is connected to the input shaft. The input shaft is connected to the output shaft through gears, and therefore when we pull that clutch lever, we disengage the crankshaft from the input shaft, and we're then able to change gear, or we're able to come to a stop. So I'll just go ahead and quickly remove the lifting plates. So they're held on with these 4 bolts. I'm just going to quickly remove. Now, you'll also notice that in the center of the lifting plate there is a little metal piece here. So this little metal piece is what actually acts on the lifting plate. And there's a little bearing in the middle of that. So let's just take a look at it here. So the push rod is basically closed end here. So push rod sits in this little, I suppose it's a little metal seat. And when you push on the push rod, it actually pushes the whole unit. Okay, and it's mounted on a little bearing so that the whole thing can rotate freely. Okay, so this bearing is quite important, that it is actually not damaged. Here is our springs. The springs, obviously, when the bolts are screwed in, they're compressed, and they're what keep that pressure on the clutch pack. So the springs, the compressed springs, they're quite stiff once you try to press them. Compressed springs keep the pressure on the clutch pack and keep the friction plates rotating with the plane plates. And when we push on these springs, we release that pressure. So remove my springs. Now, the whole pack, in this case, is held on just this little washer, spring washer. So I can remove it with a little, so, okay, there we go. So it's just a little spring washer. So once that's removed, now on other motorcycles there will actually probably be a bolt, but on the smaller CC engine I suppose it's not as important. Now once that's removed, I can actually remove my entire clutch pack. Okay, there we go. So there's our clutch pack. Again, clutch pack, this is the pressure plate. We have our alternating between friction plate and plane plate. So you can see the plane plate is actually the metal plates. In between the discolored or bronze colored friction plates. Okay, and they're all held on with the clutch center. So there we have, you can see the teeth on the clutch center which connect with the teeth on the clutch center connect with the teeth, which you can see on the plain plates here. So the plain plates have teeth on the inside, and the friction plates, as I mentioned, have teeth on the outside. There's a friction plate. It has a special friction material which wears over time, so it has to be they have to be replaced as a set. And there's our plain plate. It's just a plain metal plate. So it's all quite simple, but very effective. So again, take a look at my video on how a clutch works, where I go into this and just spend a little bit more time working on it in detail, or explaining it in detail. Now, the clutch housing is basically held on. Again, there's just this little washer, so it has little teeth on it which fit in like that, and it kind of secures it in place. But it comes off quite easily, and once that comes off, so I'll remove my primary drive gear from the crankshaft, and now I can remove the clutch housing along with the driven gear from the input shaft. So there we can see the primary, or the driven gear, primary driven gear is secured on permanently. I can't remove it from the clutch housing. So that's our clutch. Now, underneath here we have our gear shift mechanism. So the gear shift mechanism is what changes the gears. So again, I've done a detailed video on how the gear shift mechanism works, but just to show you briefly, when I want to change gear, I pull the clutch lever and I press the gear change lever with my left foot usually, or I either press it down or I pull it up with my left toe. Okay, now when I do that, obviously the engine is going to be sitting down here. The lever that I press on will be connected on to the end of this shaft here. So it will be connected on here somewhere, might be connected here, not sure which. So we want to go down gear, we push down. If we want to go up gear, we pull it up. Okay? Now this shaft goes the whole way through the engine to the gear change mechanism. So the gear change mechanism is acted from the other side with our left foot. And essentially when we change gear, the gear change mechanism will move. If we want to put it into first gear, it's now in neutral. I'll push it down. That's what the gear change mechanism does. It just goes down like that, and it moves this little drum. Okay. So it's this little drum here, or it's on the end of the drum. So there's a little drum which is connected with the gearbox. So this is connected into the gearbox. So the gearbox is in the center of the motorcycle, and the gear change mechanism is what, if I want to move it back up the gears again, or move it down the gears, whichever, I will move this, I will shift it with my foot. I'll either pull it up like that, like now, check that it's in gear. Okay, so there we go. That's bringing it back to neutral. Okay, so now my input shaft is disconnected, or it's in neutral. So it's the input shaft here is not in gear with the output shaft, and on the end of the output shaft we have the front sprocket. So you can see that the front sprocket is rotating here independently of the input shaft, and the input shaft is rotating independently of the front sprocket. So that's when it's in gear. When it's put back into gear, you will see shift it back into gear. Okay, so now we're in first gear. So there we can see as I turn the input shaft, it's rotating, it's causing the front sprocket to rotate because it's on the end of the output shaft. And I can remove this gear change mechanism and actually just really simply slide straight out like this. And there's our input shaft, or the shaft that our gear change mechanism is on the end of. So again, I've done that in a lot more detail in a separate video, so please take a look at that if you want to learn more.